Everyone who slept in this room woke up certain. They didn't dream. They didn't argue with themselves. And for some of them, that was fatal. Daniel Moore checked into the Blackmere Hotel on a Tuesday. Not because it was cheap. Not because it was close to anything important. Because it was quiet. That mattered more than comfort. The receptionist smiled with professional restraint. "Just one night?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "One is enough," he said. She hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "We have one room left," she said. "Room 17. Daniel didn't notice the way her fingers tightened around the key card. "That's fine," he said. "I won't be difficult." She forced a smile. "No one ever is," she replied. Room 17 was on the second floor, at the end of the corridor. No windows. Daniel noticed that immediately, but felt no alarm. If anything, he felt relief. The room was smaller than expected. Minimal. Neutral. Soft lighting. Clean lines. No artwork. No distractions. Daniel set his bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence was complete. Not the kind filled with distant traffic or pipes ticking in the walls. This silence had weight. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Finally," he murmured. Daniel Moore was tired of thinking. Not tired in the physical sense. Tired in the continuous sense. His mind never stopped. Questions. Second guesses. Imagined conversations that never happened. Every decision felt like an argument he couldn't win. He had told his colleagues he needed a break. What he needed was an end to the noise. He lay down without checking his phone. That alone felt unusual. The light dimmed automatically after a few minutes. Daniel closed his eyes. And something strange happened. He did not fall asleep. There was no drifting. No fading. The thought simply stopped forming. Not abruptly. Not violently. They slowed. Like a radio dial turning toward static. Then silence. When Daniel opened his eyes again, the room looked the same. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No dreams. No images. But the feeling in his chest was different. Lighter. Clearer. Daniel sat up and checked the clock. 6:14 a.m. He did not feel rested. He felt finished. At breakfast, he surprised himself. When the waiter asked how he slept, Daniel answered honestly. "Perfectly," he said. "I don't remember any of it." The waiter smiled politely. "That's good," he said. Daniel hesitated. "No," he corrected. "It's decisive." The word tasted right. By noon, Daniel had resigned from his job. He did it calmly. No speeches. No bitterness. "I've already decided," he said when his manager asked if he was sure. And he was. The certainty felt solid. Heavy. Like something he could finally lean on. That afternoon, Daniel sold his car. The next day, his house. Friends called. Daniel didn't answer. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He simply didn't see the point in explaining decisions that no longer felt negotiable. 3 days later, Daniel Moore was reported missing. A week after that, he was found dead at the bottom of a coastal cliff. The investigation would later conclude. No signs of struggle. No intoxication. No note. Just a man who walked somewhere deliberately and did not turn back. The hotel refunded the night. Quietly. No one mentioned room 17. But online reviews began to appear. Not dramatic. Just consistent. Best sleep of my life. I woke up knowing what to do. Strangely peaceful. I didn't dream. I didn't think. One review stood out. If you're tired of arguing with yourself, this room will help. The Blackmere Hotel did not advertise room 17. It didn't have to. People asked for it by number. 2 weeks later, Edward Hale received a call. Not from the police. From a woman who ran a wellness consultancy in London. "I don't know how to explain this properly," she said. "But several of my clients stayed in the same hotel." Edward listened. "They came back different," she continued. "Not happy. Not broken. Just resolved." Edward asked one question. "Do they still doubt their decisions?" he asked. The woman paused. "No," she said. "That's what scares me." Edward closed his eyes briefly. "Send me the address," he said. That evening, the Blackmere Hotel stood quietly against the darkening coast. Room 17 was empty. Waiting. Not to change anyone. Just to remove the argument. Edward Hale arrived at the Blackmere Hotel shortly after dusk. The building looked like it had learned how to be invisible. Not abandoned. Not welcoming. Just present enough not to draw attention. Edward parked, sat in the car for a moment, and listened. The sea was close. Too close. But he couldn't hear it. That bothered him more than it should have. The lobby was warm, minimalist, and intentionally unremarkable. Soft lighting. Muted colors. Nothing that asked questions. The receptionist looked up and smiled. "Welcome to the Blackmere," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," Edward replied. "But I'd like a room." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "For how many nights?" "1," Edward said. A pause. "Not long. Just noticeable." "We do have availability," she said carefully. "Any preference?" Edward met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "Room 17." Her smile tightened. "For research purposes?" she asked. Edward nodded. "That's one way to put it," he said. She exhaled quietly. "I'll need to ask the manager," she said. Edward waited. Samuel Grant entered the lobby like a man stepping into a familiar argument. Late 40s. Well-dressed. Calm in the way people get when they've rehearsed their beliefs for years. "Mr. Hale," Grant said, extending a hand. "I'm Samuel Grant. I own the hotel." Edward shook it. "You know who I am," Edward said. Grant smiled. "You'd be surprised how many people read when they're interested in the mind," he said. Edward glanced around. "Interesting place," Edward said. "That's intentional," Grant replied. "Most hotels try to entertain. We try to subtract." Edward nodded. "That's usually where the damage is," he said. Grant's smile flickered, just slightly. They walked through the corridors together. Thick carpet. Soft walls. No echoes. Edward noticed the absence immediately. "Soundproofing?" Edward asked. Grant nodded. "Guests come here to disconnect," he said. "Noise is intrusive." Edward stopped near room 17. "And silence?" Edward asked. Grant smiled. "Silence is restorative," he said. Edward looked at the door. "Or persuasive," he said. Grant didn't answer that. Inside, room 17 looked exactly as described. No windows. No clock on the wall. No art. The air felt still. Not stale. Contained. Edward sat on the edge of the bed. Grant remained standing. "No staff member stays in this room," Edward said. Grant didn't deny it. "They don't need to," he said. "They work here. They're already quiet." Edward looked up. "That's not an answer," he said. Grant's voice stayed calm. "They tried," he said. "They didn't like it." Edward walked the perimeter of the room slowly. Walls. Floor. Ceiling. Nothing obvious. No chemicals, Edward said. No, Grant replied. That would be crude. No hypnosis, Edward continued. Impossible without cooperation, Grant said. Edward nodded. And yet, Edward said, people leave here altered. Grant folded his hands. People leave here honest, he said. Edward turned. About what? Edward asked. Grant smiled faintly. Themselves, he said. That night, Edward stayed awake. Not because he was afraid. Because the room made sleeping feel unnecessary. The silence pressed gently. Not like weight. Like absence. Thoughts came slower. Edward focused deliberately. Stay alert. Observe. Resist conclusions. He felt the effort required. That was new. Hours passed. Or maybe they didn't. Edward checked his watch. It was still working. Good. He stood, paced, spoke aloud. Edward Hale, he said. You are in a hotel room. The sound of his voice felt intrusive. Like breaking a rule. Edward smiled grimly. Interesting, he murmured. At 3:12 a.m., Edward noticed the first real effect. Not sleep. Not confusion. Stillness. The urge to decide something. Anything. To end the open loop. He sat back down immediately. No, he said quietly. Not tonight. The silence did not respond. That was worse. Morning came without announcement. Edward did not feel rested. He felt aligned. He disliked that intensely. Grant waited for him in the lobby. Well? Grant asked. Edward looked at him carefully. You've built a room where doubt dissolves, Edward said. Grant nodded. Doubt is inefficient, he said. Edward's voice hardened. So is conscience, he replied. Grant tilted his head. You think doubt is moral, he asked. Edward met his gaze. I think doubt is human, he said. They sat opposite each other, coffee between them. Grant spoke first. People come here exhausted by internal arguments, he said. I give them silence. Edward replied calmly. You give them compliance, he said. Grant smiled. They choose, he said. Edward leaned forward. Without resistance, he replied. That's not choice. That's momentum. Grant's eyes sharpened. You sound afraid of clarity, Grant said. Edward nodded. I am, he said. When it's unearned. Edward stood. I'm staying another night, he said. Grant's smile returned. Of course, he said. Room 17. Edward nodded. Yes, he said. But this time, I'll be listening. Grant watched him walk away. You won't hear anything, Grant said. Edward paused. That, he replied, is exactly the problem. Edward Hale did not dream. That fact bothered him more than it should have. Not because he expected nightmares, but because dreams were a form of resistance. The mind talking back. In room 17, the mind went quiet. He woke at 6:02 a.m. No alarm. No disorientation. Just awareness. Edward sat up slowly and waited for the familiar friction to return. It didn't. His thoughts were orderly. Too orderly. Ideas lined up without conflict, like files already sorted. Edward closed his eyes. What do you want? He asked himself. The answer came immediately. To finish this case. Edward opened his eyes sharply. That was not how thinking usually worked. He showered in silence. No internal commentary. No running narrative. The absence felt efficient. Tempting. Edward recognized the danger instantly. At breakfast, he tested himself. He chose the wrong tea on purpose. He waited for irritation. Nothing. He sat back in his chair. So that's it, he murmured. You remove friction. The waiter glanced at him. Sorry, he asked. Edward smiled politely. Nothing, he said. Just thinking. The lie felt unnecessary. Edward requested access to the maintenance levels. Grant approved it immediately. Transparency is part of the philosophy, Grant said. Edward noted the phrasing. Not policy. Philosophy. The basement corridors were narrow, utilitarian. Edward followed the ductwork carefully. No chemicals. No vents releasing scent. Then he heard it. Not sound. Pressure. A low-frequency vibration just beneath perception. Edward stopped walking. There you are, he said quietly. The engineer looked nervous. We're within legal limits, the man said quickly. Edward held up a hand. I'm not interested in legality, he said. I'm interested in effect. The man swallowed. It's calming, he said. That's what Mr. Grant wanted. Edward nodded. Calming for whom? He asked. The engineer hesitated. For people who can't stop thinking, he said. Edward wrote that down. Later, Edward sat with Grant in the lounge. You use infrasound, Edward said flatly. Grant didn't deny it. Barely, he said. Just enough to encourage stillness. Edward leaned back. You know it disrupts internal speech, Edward said. Grant nodded. Yes, he said. That's the point. Edward's voice remained even. You're not helping people rest, he said. You're interrupting self-correction. Grant smiled. You say that like it's a virtue, he said. Edward met his gaze. It's survival, he said. Grant poured himself coffee. People argue themselves into paralysis, Grant said. I remove the argument. Edward shook his head. You remove the counterweight, he said. And whatever idea is heaviest falls. Grant considered that. And isn't that honesty? He asked. Edward answered immediately. No, he said. That's gravity. That afternoon, Edward interviewed former guests. Not the ones who complained. The ones who praised. A woman in her 30s spoke calmly. I woke up knowing I had to leave my marriage, she said. Edward nodded. Did you question it? He asked. No, she replied. That was the relief. Edward wrote carefully. A man described quitting his job. It felt obvious, he said. Like I'd been stupid not to see it. Edward looked up. Do you still feel that way? He asked. The man hesitated. I think so, he said. Edward underlined the pause. By evening, Edward understood the mechanism fully. The room did not implant decisions. It removed hesitation. And hesitation, Edward knew, was not weakness. It was calibration. Edward returned to room 17 voluntarily. He sat on the bed and closed his eyes. The silence pressed in again. Thought slowed. An image formed uninvited. His old office. Stacks of case files. The decision to leave the police. Edward's chest tightened. That was certainty, a part of him said. Edward opened his eyes. No, he said aloud. That was collapse. The room did not respond. That frightened him more than anything else so far. At 11:47 p.m., Edward noticed something new. The urge wasn't just to decide. It was to simplify. Reduce. End complexity. Edward stood abruptly and turned on every light. He spoke loudly. I'm here, he said. I'm thinking. I'm uncertain. The silence retreated slightly. Not gone. But disturbed. Edward breathed out. So that's how, he said quietly. He left the room before midnight. Grant was waiting in the corridor. You didn't stay, Grant observed. Edward met his gaze. I don't need conversion, Edward said. I need confirmation. Grant smiled faintly. And, he asked. Edward's voice was cold. You're not removing pain, he said. You're removing friction that prevents irreversible decisions. Grant's eyes sharpened. People want certainty, Grant said. Edward nodded. Until it kills them, he replied. Grant leaned closer. You think doubt is sacred, Grant said. Edward answered without hesitation. I think doubt keeps the door open, he said. Grant smiled. And I think doors are overrated. Edward looked at him steadily. Then you shouldn't lock them from the inside, he said. That night, Edward wrote one sentence in his notebook. Silence is not neutral. He underlined it twice. Outside, the Blackmere Hotel stood quietly against the dark coast. Room 17 was empty again. But the absence it created lingered, waiting for the next argument to remove. Edward Hale did not call the police immediately. That was deliberate. Not because he doubted the danger, but because he understood it. This was not a crime scene problem. It was a consent problem. And consent, once quietly engineered, was difficult to prove. He met Samuel Grant in the lounge just after noon. The room was designed to make confrontation feel unnecessary. Soft chairs. Warm light. No sharp edges. Grant gestured for Edward to sit. You stayed awake, Grant said. Most people don't. Edward didn't sit. I left, he replied. That's more important. Grant smiled faintly. Running from clarity, he asked. Edward shook his head. Interrupting it, he said. Grant's eyes sharpened. Edward placed his notebook on the table. I spoke to your guests, Edward said. You know what they all had in common. Grant leaned back. They were tired, he said. Of course. Edward nodded. Yes, he said. And you met them at exactly the moment when resistance feels immoral. Grant tilted his head. Explain. Edward's voice stayed calm. When someone is exhausted, doubt feels like cruelty, he said. So when you remove doubt, they call it kindness. Grant smiled. Exactly, he said. Edward's eyes hardened. And that's how you know it's dangerous, he said. Grant stood and walked slowly toward the windowless wall. You think I'm forcing decisions, Grant said. I'm not. I'm removing interference. Edward followed him with his gaze. You're removing friction, Edward said. And friction exists for a reason. Grant turned. So does pain, he replied. Yet you medicate it. Edward answered immediately. Pain warns, he said. Silence persuades. Grant paused. That landed. Edward continued. Daniel Moore didn't jump because he wanted to die, Edward said. He jumped because the room convinced him the argument was over. Grant's voice cooled. He was free, Grant said. Edward shook his head. He was unopposed, he replied. Grant's tone sharpened slightly for the first time. You assume people should keep arguing forever, he said. Edward shook his head again. No, he said. I assume arguments should end with witnesses. Grant frowned. With what? With consequences, Edward said. And with time. Grant studied him. You're afraid of speed, Grant said. Edward nodded. Yes, he said. When it outruns reflection. Edward leaned forward. You built a room where the loudest thought wins by default, he said. You didn't help people decide. You crowned whatever idea happened to be standing last. Grant's jaw tightened. You can't prove intent, he said. Edward nodded. No, he said. But I can prove design. Edward stood. I asked the engineer a question, he said. Not about limits. About purpose. Grant didn't respond. He told me you asked for stillness, Edward continued. Not rest. Not sleep. Stillness. Grant's silence stretched. That's because stillness ends conflict, Grant said finally. Edward's voice dropped. It ends appeal, he said. Edward slid a folder across the table. Inside were statements. Not complaints. Confessions. Former guests describing how quickly they'd acted. How they'd cut ties. How they'd made irreversible choices within days. Grant flipped through them. Testimonials, Grant said. You're proving my point. Edward shook his head. No, he said. I'm proving a pattern. Grant looked up. And patterns scare you, he said. Edward met his gaze. Only the ones that pretend to be peace, he replied. That evening, Edward made the call. Not to the police. To the regulatory board. And then to the press. Not with accusations. With questions. By morning, room 17 was no longer private. Inspectors arrived. Engineers measured. Lawyers asked careful questions. Grant stood calmly through it all. You won't shut it down, he told Edward quietly. People want this. Edward nodded. Yes, he said. That's why it needs supervision. Grant's smile faded. The decisive moment came unexpectedly. A guest collapsed in the corridor. Not unconscious. Frozen. I can't decide, the man whispered. I don't know what to do anymore. Edward knelt beside him. What did you lose? Edward asked. The man swallowed. My doubts, he said. Edward looked up at Grant. There, Edward said. That's the cost. Grant stared at the man. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Just briefly. Room 17 was closed that afternoon. Officially, for review. Unofficially, because its effect was no longer deniable. Grant watched as the door was sealed. You're afraid of what people become without doubt, he said. Edward answered quietly. No, he said. I'm afraid of who decides for them. Grant didn't reply. That night, the hotel felt louder. Not in sound. In presence. Guests shifted. Couples talked. People argued quietly with themselves again. Edward welcomed it. Before leaving, Edward wrote one final note and left it with Grant. Certainty without resistance is coercion. Grant read it twice. He didn't tear it up. That worried Edward. The Blackmere Hotel did not close. That surprised the people who wanted a clean ending. Room 17, however, remained sealed. Officially, pending review. Unofficially, because no one could agree on how to reopen it safely. Edward Hale considered that a small success. Small successes were the only honest kind. Samuel Grant stayed on as owner. He gave interviews carefully. We're reassessing our wellness model, he said. Our priority is guest safety. Edward noticed what he did not say. Nothing about doubt. Nothing about stillness. Nothing about choice. Grant had learned something. That did not mean he had changed. The man who collapsed in the corridor recovered within hours. Doctors found nothing wrong. He told Edward one thing before he left. When it went quiet, the man said, I thought I'd finally reached peace. Edward nodded. And then, he asked. And then, the man said quietly, there was no one left to argue with me. Edward did not correct him. Edward stayed one last night in the hotel. Not in room 17. In a standard room with thin walls and an unreliable heater. He slept badly. He woke twice. He welcomed both. At 3:40 a.m., he lay awake listening to a couple in the next room argue softly. Not angrily. Carefully. Edward smiled faintly. That was the sound of people still negotiating their lives. In the morning, Edward checked out. The receptionist asked politely, "Did you rest well?" Edward considered the question. "No," he said. "But I woke up uncertain." She smiled, confused. "That sounds tiring," she said. Edward nodded. "It is," he replied. "That's how I know it's mine." On the drive back, Edward turned the radio on immediately. Not for music. For interference. Voices overlapped. Opinions clashed. Advertisements contradicted themselves. Edward felt his thoughts slow, then push back. Good. He stopped once, halfway home, at a small cafe by the road. A man at the next table spoke into his phone. "I don't know," the man said. "I need to think about it." Edward listened to the sentence carefully. No relief. No finality. Just process. Edward finished his coffee and left a larger tip than usual. That evening, Edward returned to his flat. He unpacked slowly. No urgency. He noticed something subtle. The echo of room 17 was gone. Not completely, but enough. Edward sat at his desk and opened his notebook. He added one final line under the previous entry. Noise is not the enemy. Silence is not neutral. He closed the book. His phone buzzed. A message this time. Unknown number. I stayed in a room where everything went quiet. I made a decision I can't undo. Edward stared at the screen. Then typed a reply. Do you still feel certain? The response came after a pause. No. Edward exhaled slowly. Good, he typed. Then we can talk. Outside, the city hummed. Traffic. Distant voices. A neighbor's radio playing too loudly. Edward did not shut the window. He let it in. Uncertainty, he had learned, did not mean weakness. It meant participation. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more psychological mysteries where nothing supernatural is happening, and that's what makes it disturbing. New detective stories are released regularly. Until next time, pay attention to the words people choose.